We're in Philemon still. So it's this week, and then we're going to finish up Philemon next week. This week we're looking at verse 18, and then next week we'll look at 19 through the end of the chapter. But Philemon, looking at grace in action, I want to say thank you. I know that they're not all here, but to the ladies for the wonderful meal this afternoon, and taking care of everything. Certainly appreciate that as well. As I mentioned before, this letter to Philemon, it is a brief but deeply profound exploration of Christian relationships, of forgiveness, and the redemptive work of the gospel. In Philemon, verse 18 in particular, where we are this evening, the Apostle Paul writes to Philemon concerning Onesimus, a runaway slave who has wronged his master. And Paul's words, they reveal the heart of Christian grace and the willingness to bear another's burdens. And the verse reads, "But if he has wronged you in any way or owes you anything, charge that to my account." Now, at the heart of this particular verse lies the language of debt, which Paul employs as both a practical and a theological metaphor. The Greek term there, which refers to an obligation, it's often financial. And by using this term, Paul, he addresses a concrete reality. That Onesimus, by fleeing, he likely caused Philemon some financial loss. Now, that financial loss, it might have been through theft. It could have been through a loss of labor, a damaged reputation that he couldn't, quote-unquote, keep his slaves in line. We don't really know. But there is an outstanding debt that requires resolution. And in the Roman world, such a debt would typically result in punishment for the offending party, especially a runaway slave. However, Paul steps into the situation and offers to take on Onesimus' debt. He says, "Charge that to my account." And this act of assuming another's debt recalls the ancient biblical principle of restitution. It was a key element of justice in the Old Testament. Over in Exodus chapter 22 and verse 1, it outlines the requirement that a thief need to repay the value multiple times over for whatever was stolen. It says, if a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. So even if he stole it, even if he didn't use it as a sacrifice, even if he didn't maybe kill it and eat it, but he sold it to someone else to get the money to pay back a debt, kind of a robbing Peter to pay Paul type of situation, is that he still had to pay it back multiple times over. See, restitution, it was the means by which relationships, they were restored and justice was enacted in ancient Israel. Paul, though, he goes beyond the strict requirements of justice. The strict requirements of justice based in the Old Testament would insist that Onesimus repay the debt himself. But instead, Paul offers to pay it on his behalf, embodying that spirit of grace. And Paul's offer to settle Onesimus' debt, it mirrors the work of Christ in the New Testament, where Jesus is portrayed as the ultimate mediator who bears the sins and debts of humanity. He's the go-between. That phrase, "charge that to my account," it carries the weight of substitution. See, Paul, he's willing to stand in Onesimus' place and assume responsibility for his wrongdoings. And this act of intercession points to a larger theological reality of Christ's atoning work on the cross for our behalf. In 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 21, Paul, he writes, "He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him." And so just as Christ took upon himself the sin and debt of humanity, so Paul, in a smaller but still significant way, he offers to take on the debt of Onesimus. And that reflects the heart of the gospel, which is substitutionary atonement. There is atonement by substitution, right? It is that Christ, the substitute, stood in our place and made the atoning sacrifice. That's what it is. It's where one stands in the place of another to restore that which was lost. And this self-sacrificial nature of Paul's offer, it goes even back to Isaiah, that chapter 53 of the suffering servant there. In Isaiah 53 and verse 5, he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening of our well-being fell upon him. And by his scourging, or some translations say by his stripes, we are healed. And so just as the suffering servant in Isaiah bears witness of others, bears the weight of others' wrongdoing, Paul steps into the role of a mediator for Onesimus. And his appeal to Philemon, it highlights a key aspect of the gospel, and that is grace triumphing over law. In the Roman context, Philemon, he would have had every legal right to demand punishment and repayment from Onesimus. Under Roman law, even under Jewish law, because there are still Jews at this time practicing Old Testament Mosaic Judaism. So in either way, he would have been within his legal right. The law, both Roman and Mosaic, upheld the rights of masters over their slaves. And a runaway slave could face severe consequences, including death. Not just a repayment of debt, but death. But Paul, he doesn't appeal to Philemon's legal rights. Instead, he appeals to grace. Remember, through this letter, he's been saying, I could command you to do this, but I'm not trying to command you. I'm wanting you to do it out of your own heart. I don't want you to see him as a runaway slave, but as a brother in Christ. So he's making this appeal throughout, and he gets here. And again, he appeals to grace. The law in the Old Testament demanded restitution and consequences for wrongdoing, but the New Testament reveals a deeper principle of grace and forgiveness that transcends legal requirements. Paul's willingness to absorb Onesimus' debt reflects the teaching of Christ in Matthew 5 and verse 40 and 41. There it says, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. Jesus' teaching calls for a radical generosity and grace that goes beyond the strict letter of the law. Paul embodies that principle in this letter to Philemon, urging him to respond not with punishment, but with forgiveness and acceptance. And moreover, this grace, it's not blind to justice. Paul doesn't dismiss Onesimus' wrongdoings. He doesn't say he was right for leaving. Now, he does mention that maybe it was a part of God's plan that Onesimus was removed from him for a little while so that he could come back as a brother. But he doesn't dismiss it. He doesn't say Onesimus did the right thing. He didn't say anything like that. So instead, he offers to take responsibility for them. Grace in the Christian sense, it doesn't negate, it doesn't eliminate justice, but instead it transforms it. Romans 6 and verse 14, for sin shall not be a master over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. Philemon's potential response to Onesimus serves as a lived expression of that truth, that in Christ, grace surpasses the demands of the law. Because the Bible would also say that that he who is guilty of just one part of the law is guilty of all of it. So that's why we need God's grace. And I think that can be something that's missing in many congregations in this world. That we are so intent on saying this is black and white that we forget God's grace. And Paul, while he offers to pay Onesimus' debt, it's clear that reconciliation comes at a cost. See, Paul's intercession reminds us that true reconciliation, whether between Philemon and Onesimus or between God and humanity, it requires sacrifice. Paul's willingness to assume the financial and social burden on behalf of Onesimus, it foreshadows the costly nature of forgiveness and restoration. There is sacrifice there. And that concept of costly reconciliation, that too is rooted in the Old Testament sacrificial system, where the blood of animals was required for atonement, and the restoration of the covenant relationship between God and Israel. Leviticus 17:11, it says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood by reason of the life that makes atonement." And in this system, reconciliation with God came at the cost of an innocent life. In the same way, in the New Testament, Christ's death on the cross, it is the ultimate expression of the cost of reconciliation. Colossians 1 and verse 20, "And through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross, through him, I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven." So reconciliation came and peace was made through his blood, through the cross. And the reconciliation between Philemon and Onesimus, it's kind of a microcosm of the larger picture of Christ, that Christ achieved through his death. Paul's willingness to bear the cost on behalf of Onesimus, it's a reflection of the greater cost that Christ bore for all believers. Paul's appeal there in Philemon 1:18 challenges him, Philemon, and by extension all believers, to practice a radical forgiveness that's at the heart of the Christian faith. We can find it difficult to forgive. And yet, in holding our grudges and just holding on to those emotions and letting people live rent-free in our heads and not letting go of anger and bitterness and all of these things, we forget the cost of our own forgiveness, the death of Christ. By offering to settle Onesimus' debt, Paul calls Philemon to let go of any claim for retribution. Let go of anything the law allows you to do. But instead, embrace a posture of grace and restoration. That was a challenge by Jesus over in Matthew 18:21 and 22, where Peter, he asked, "How many times am I supposed to forgive his brother?" And he says, "I don't say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. And no, let's not sit here and do the math and say, okay, let's carry one and all of that. But that's not the point of it. Is the forgiveness that Paul advocates, it's not limited by human calculations. It's a reflection of the boundless forgiveness that believers receive from God. And Paul's appeal to encourage Philemon to restore Onesimus, not just as a slave, but if you look back at verse 16, as a brother in Christ, it's a call for us to restore broken relationships. That's a central theme of the New Testament. In Galatians 6 and verse 1, Paul exhorts the church, "Brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness." Forgiveness is not complete without restoration. And restoration requires humility, love, and recognition of the other's new identity in Christ. And at the core of Paul's appeal is the power of the gospel. Onesimus, once considered a useless, remember his name, Onesimus, useful. Once considered a useless runaway, he is now a useful member of the Christian community there we see in verse 11. The gospel transforms individuals from sinners to saints, from slaves to brothers, and from debtors into members of God's family. The theme of transformation is woven throughout the New Testament. In 2 Corinthians 5, verse 17, Paul writes, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creature. The old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new." Onesimus' new identity in Christ is the foundation for Paul's request that Philemon accept him, forgive him of his past debts. The gospel not only erases the record of wrongs, but also creates new possibilities for relationships, for unity, for fellowship. Verse 18, it really is a powerful reminder of the cost of reconciliation. The power of grace, the call to forgive as we have been forgiven. The Lord taught them to pray. We are to, Lord, forgive me of my trespasses as I forgive those who have trespassed against me. Are we truly a forgiving people? Are we seeking reconciliation? Paul's willingness to take on Onesimus' debt, that's the heart of the gospel. It's more than just a personal letter. This letter is unlike any other letter that Paul wrote. It's a very personal letter from one man to another regarding another. And yet, in it, there is so much of the gospel. Philemon called to respond by grace, accepting, forgiving, and restoring. And that forgiving and that reconciliation, that's moving on. Remember, the wrongs are gone. I could sit there and say, yeah, I forgive you, and then just still harbor bitterness and still talk about, what so-and-so did to me and all of this, but that's not reconciliation. This is me not holding it against him. Because I'll tell you, Christ dying on the cross for us. When we die, and we know Hebrews 9:27, it's appointed for a time for each of us to die, and after that comes judgment. Christ is not going to say, yes, I died for them. But remember what he did before he was a Christian? Can we put that up on the scoreboard? Christ isn't going to do that. We're not called to do that either. So kind of your homework for this week, reach out to those that have wronged you in some way. Reach out to those you've wronged. And seek reconciliation. Now here's the thing though. Some people don't want reconciliation. That's just the truth of it. You can offer forgiveness, you can try to reconcile until you are blue in the face, and there are just some people that don't want it for one reason or another. That is not on you for them to accept it. It's on you to do it. It's on me to do it. Just as Jesus says, go into all the world, preach, teach, baptize, and what have you. It's not up to me if those individuals that I do that with too, if they accept the gospel or not, that's on them. My responsibility is to preach, teach, and baptize. All we can do is make the effort. And you might sit there and you might be saying, well, you know what? I've tried to make the effort. I have tried. Every which way but loose. 6 times on Sunday. And they just still go, when do I stop? If you have done everything that you believe in your heart you could do, and it takes an examination of the heart. Some people might say, well, I made a phone call and they didn't pick up the phone. Well, how many times did you call them? Well, I called them once and I let it ring 1.5 times. Okay, were you really seeking reconciliation there? If you in examining the situation and in examining your heart and your actions toward reconciliation, and you believe that you have done everything that you can do and you have just been turned away at every corner, then just let it go and just continue to pray for the person and pray for reconciliation. And maybe it's something that after a couple of weeks or a couple of months, you can try to revisit. Some people don't want it. Some people aren't in the right mindset to talk about it right then. And they might need some more time to process. And I know that it can be hard, and we might say, well, is God going to hold that against me? Well, did you do what you were, did you even try? See, and that's the thing. We often forget about God's grace. We say, is God going to hold it against me? Well, did you try everything that you could do? Did you examine your heart? Did you examine the situation? Are you continuing to pray for that person? Are you going to be intentional in a couple of weeks or a couple of months to try to do it? If so, then you have to trust in God. You've got to leave the results in Him. You do what you can do. But that's the homework for this week, is to just, if there is someone in your life that you need to be reconciled to, try. And if there's not, then maybe you have a friend, and they're trying to reconcile. Offer in a way to be a mediator if you can. Say, look, I know you've been trying to reconcile with this person, and maybe things haven't been going to plan. Would you be okay with me talking to them? Not me. I mean, I'll be happy to do it, but you know what I mean. You know, offer to help in some way. Remember, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And if there is anything at all that you need, anything that I can help with, maybe you need the prayers of the congregation, we can do that. And you can make it known publicly as we stand and as we sing.